Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to my reaction channel. My name is Setting90. Today we're going to be reacting to Mesopotamia, Crash Course World History number 3. This is like the third time I've tried to do this video so far, so forgive me if I don't talk for the first like 2 minutes because I've already said my piece about the kept getting interrupted or the tech would break or whatever the hell. Everyone knows Crash Course. Go subscribe to Crash Course. Go like Crash Course. They deserve all the love and everything else in the world. If you watched the other video that I did building a Mars-based horrible idea, Girls I Got, you know I immediately switched from that one to this one, but things happened. Things broke. Let's go.
Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about Iraq. No, you purportedly smart globe. We're going to talk about Mesopotamia. I love Mesopotamia because it helped create two of my favorite things, writing and taxes. Why do I like taxes? Because before taxes, the only certainty was death.
Also, taxes give you roads, healthcare, and other things. Taxes are useful. They give you military and other things. Taxes are good. Taxes are the backbone civilization is built on.
Mr. Green, did you know that you're referencing Mark Twain? I'm not referencing Mark Twain, me from the past. I'm referencing Benjamin Franklin, who was probably himself referencing the unfortunately named playwright Christopher Bullock. Listen, you may be smart, kid, but I've been smart longer. By the way, today's illustration...
I feel that. I 100% feel that. You may be smart, kid, but I've been smarter longer. I was a smart kid. I was the kind of kid who would get A's when he tried. But I skipped way too much during high school, so I didn't. But yeah, I get that. Where like looking back, it's like, yeah, I was smart back then, but boy, I was dumb. And it's gonna be the same thing now, where I'm gonna look back and be like, wow, I should have tried hard in university, but whatever. It's the same thing. Same issues. You never really change. Well, you do, but you did.
Points out that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world monocular. So about 5,000 years ago, in the land Meso, or between the Tigris and Euphrates Potomoi, or rivers, cities started popping up, much like they had in our old friend the Indus River Valley. These early Mesopotamian cities engaged in a form of socialism where farmers contributed their crops to public storehouses, out of which workers, like metal workers or builders or male models or whatever, would be paid uniform wages in grain. So basically... Mr. Green, were there really male models? Can you do blue steel? Oh, younger version of myself. How I hate you. Oh, the humiliation I suffer for you people. That was my best blue steel. That was as close as I can get. So anyway.
I understand. I get that. I have something similar with myself where I was doing the flaws. Do I show it? I showed it in the last one. Oh, I could. Yeah, we're doing it. You get to see me flossing. It is just as horrific as you'd imagine. Don't mind all these tabs. Don't judge me. Or judge me. I don't really care. Your hatred fuels me. Clips. There's probably an easier way to do this, but I'm also stupid. So here it is.
Yeah, that's a joke.
You got to watch me floss.
And then the floss is this?
No.
I don't know how to
Look at that body. That is peak masculinity right there.
I'm not nearly drunk enough for this.
Alright, that's enough of my own humiliation. But I feel his man.
If you lived in a city, you could be something other than a shepherd, and thanks to this proto-socialism, you could be reasonably sure that you'd eat. Stan, is there any way we can get another globe in here? I feel like this shot is inadequately globed. Yes, much better. You know, you can tell the quality of a historian by the number of his or her globes. But even though you could give up your flock, a lot of people didn't want to, and one of the legacies of Mesopotamia is the enduring conflict between country and city. You see this explored a lot in some of our greatest art, like the Beverly.
His hands are glowing. Give me a second. What? His
Between
hands are glowing.
country
Is he a Time
and
Lord?
city. You see this explored a lot in some of our
Look at that. His hands
greatest
are glowing. He's magical. John Green is magical. But yeah, you see that everywhere. The battle between rural and country, rural and city. City pretty much always wins. Occasionally, the country or the rural people end up rising up, putting their own people in power, rising up and conquering the city people, but then they just end up becoming city people. You see that all the time, where like horse lords would conquer somewhere, then they end up settling and become part of the culture, become city people, and then the cycle would repeat itself because people naturally gravitate towards cities. Even when they destroy all the cities, people end up rebuilding cities because people like, because that is just how humans function. So cities always win. That's just how it works.
Art, like the Beverly Hillbillies and Deliverance, and the showdown between Enkidu and Gilgamesh in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Is he just like fully erect there? It looks like he's just kind of fully erect. Good for him, I guess.
Gilgamesh is one of the oldest known works of literature, and I'm not going to spoil it for you. There's a link to the poem in the video info, but suffice it to say that in the showdown between country and city, the city wins. So what were these city-states like? Well, let's take a look at one such city-state, Gilgamesh's hometown of Uruk, in the Thought Bubble. Uruk was a walled city with an extensive canal system and several monumental temples called ziggurats. The priests of these temples initially had all the power because they were able to communicate directly with the gods, and that was a useful talent because Mesopotamian gods were moody and frankly pretty mean. Like, according to Gilgamesh, they once got mad at us because we were making too much noise while they were trying to sleep, so they decided to destroy all of humanity with a flood. The Tigris and Euphrates are decent as rivers go, but Mesopotamia is no Indus Valley.
A lot of old style gods, a lot of like ancient gods were moody, temperamental assholes. Like that's the whole point of the ancient gods. Like look at the Greek gods or the Norse gods or anything else like that. Like they weren't, like, you worship them because they were incredibly powerful, not because you particularly liked them. Like that was their whole thing. Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and then Christianity, which is a branch off of Judaism, and Judaism is thought to have been a branch off, or had a similar ancestor to Zoroastrianism. I can't remember what came before Zoroastrianism, but I think that was the common thread between Judaism and Zoroastrianism, which ended up, which changed the narrative, which went from there's a bunch of gods that are just assholes to there's one god or two gods who love you, and then there's one that is evil. It made things easier for people to understand. Instead of having all the gods genuinely probably dislike you or just not care, it became like there is one that actually cares about you, which obviously why that type of religion took off.
Valley with its on-schedule flooding and easy irrigation. A lot of slave labor was needed to make the Tigris and Euphrates useful for irrigation. They're also difficult to navigate and flood unpredictably and violently. Violent, unpredictable, and difficult to navigate. Oh, Tigris and Euphrates, how you remind me of my college girlfriend. So I mean, given that the region tends to yo-yo between devastating flood and horrible drought, it follows that one would believe that the gods are kind of random and capricious, and that any priests who might be able to lead rituals that placate those gods would be very useful individuals. But about 1,000 years after the first temples, we find in cities like Uruk a rival structure begins to show up. The palace. The responsibility for the well-being and success of the social order was shifting from gods to people, a power shift that will seesaw throughout human history until probably forever, actually. But in another development we'll see again, these kings, who probably started out as military leaders or really rich landowners, took on a quasi-religious role. How? Often by engaging in sacred marriage, specifically scoodily pooping with the high priestess of the city's temple. So the priests were overtaken by kings who soon declared themselves priests. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So how do we know that these kings were scoodily pooping with lady priests? Because they made a scoodily pooping tape and put it on the internet. No, because there's a written record. Mesopotamia gave us writing,
Scoodily pooping tape.
specifically a form of writing called cuneiform, which was initially created
I'm going to call it that next time.
not to like woo lovers or whatever, but to record transactions like how many bushels of wheat were exchanged for how many goats. I'm not kidding, by the way. A lot of cuneiform is about wheat and goats. I don't think you can overestimate the importance of writing, but let's just make 3 points here. First, writing and reading are things that not everyone can do, so they create a class distinction, one that in fact survives to this day. Foraging social orders were relatively egalitarian, but the Mesopotamians had slaves, and they played this metaphorically resonant sport that was like polo, except instead of riding on horses, you rode on other people. And written language played an important role in widening the gap between classes. 2, once writing enters the picture, you have actual history instead of just a lot of guesswork and archaeology. And 3, without writing,
Yeah, oral history is nonsense. You can't trust oral history. Anytime anybody's like, oh, the oral history of this, it's like, oh, that's all lies. Like, oral history is completely useless for most things. Like, it's not, it's nice stories, but it's just not helpful.
I would not have a job, so I'd like to personally thank Mesopotamia for making it possible for me to work while reclining in my lazy boy. So why did this writing happen in Mesopotamia? Well, the Fertile Crescent, while it is fertile, is lacking pretty much everything else. In order to get metal for tools, or stone for sculpture, or wood for burning, Mesopotamia had to trade. This trading eventually led Mesopotamia to develop the world's first territorial kingdom, which will become very important and will eventually culminate in some extraordinarily inbred Habsburgs. The city-state period in Mesopotamia ended around 2000 BCE, probably because drought and a shift in the course of rivers led to...
They're still around, you know, the Habsburg dynasty. Less incesty, but they're still around. They're businessmen in Austria, I think.
Pastoral nomads coming in and conquering the environmentally weakened cities, and then the nomads settled into cities of their own, as nomads almost always will, unless, wait for it, you are the Mongols.
No, they also did in the Yuan dynasty, and well, yeah, pretty much just the Yuan dynasty, and then they eventually got kicked out of Persia. I think the Ilkhanate sort of did. Well, the Mongols did in China, but everyone does in China.
These new Mesopotamian city-states were similar to their predecessors in that they had temples and writing and their own self-glorifying stories, but they were different in some important ways. First, that early proto-socialism was replaced by something that looked a lot like private enterprise, where people could produce as much as they would like as long as they gave a cut, also known as taxes, to the government. We talk a lot of smack about taxes, but it turns out they're pretty important to creating stable social orders. Things were also different politically because the dudes who'd been the tribal chiefs became like full-blown kings who tried to extend their power outside of cities and also tried to pass on their power to their sons. The most famous of these early monarchs is Hammurabi, or as I remember him from my high school history class, the Hammer of Abi. Hammurabi ruled the new kingdom of Babylon from 1792 BCE to 1750 BCE. Hammurabi's main claim to fame is his famous law code, which established everything from like the wages of ox drivers to the fact that the punishment for taking an eye should be having an eye taken. Hammurabi's law code can be pretty insanely harsh. Like if a builder builds a shoddy building and then the owner's son dies in a collapse, the punishment for that is the execution of the builder's son. The kid's like, that's not fair, I'm just a kid, what did I do? You should kill my dad. All of which is to say that Hammurabi's law code gives a new meaning to the phrase tough on crime, but it did introduce the presumption of innocence, and
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense for that time when it's like, you need a law code, and people back then were a bit more barbarous, and there was less education, things like that, so you couldn't have a civilized law code like we do now, and it was one of the first law codes to be developed. It is the first that we know of, but there was probably others that it was sort of based on, or traditions that it was based on, and nothing comes from nowhere. So of course it was harsh because the time and place it was built in was harsh, but it probably worked with the idea that like there was just one unifying law code that you just know because it was carved in stone. Like you just can know it. And you know what the punishment is. You know the different thing. It was a necessary thing. So we look back on it and saying it was barbarous, but for the time, having like an actual just like this is the law. Like this is just the law, and you can't break it. It is a massive shift because it was probably before then like a mixture of local like customs and things like that was combined into one giant cohesive behemoth of a code.
in the law code, Hammurabi tried to portray himself in two roles that should sound familiar: shepherd and father. I am the shepherd who brings peace. My benevolent shade was spread over the city. I held the peoples of Sumer and Akkad safely on my lap. So again, we see the authority for protection of the social order shifting to men, not gods, which is important, but don't worry, it'll shift back. Even though territorial kingdoms like Babylon were more powerful than any cities that had come before, and even though Babylon was probably the world's most populous city during Hammurabi's rule, it wasn't actually that powerful, and keeping with the pattern, it was soon taken over by the formerly nomadic Kassites. The thing about territorial kingdoms is they relied on the poorest people to pay taxes and provide labor and serve in the army, all of which made you not like your king very much. So if you saw any nomadic invaders coming by, you might just be like, hey, nomadic invaders, come on in, you seem better than the last guy. Well, that was the case until the Assyrians came along anyway. The Assyrians have a deserved reputation for being the brutal bullies of Mesopotamia. But the Assyrians did give us an early example of probably the most important and durable form of political organization in world history, and also Star Wars history. The empire. So the biggest problem with empires is that by definition they're diverse and multi-ethnic, which makes them hard to unify. So beginning around 911 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire grew from its home...
Unless you do what the Romans did, at least for a while, until they started collapsing, which is ethnic genocide, which is what they did in the Gauls. That's why France is less Gallic like Ireland, Wales, Brittany, and Scotland, and more Latin, because Julius Caesar and those who followed him killed millions of Gallic people, put them all to the sword, and sold the rest into slavery, and then used the remainder, and since there were so few left, the colonizers from Rome ended up being able to take over, and since it was so fertile, the population started growing fast again, and it became Latinized, became Romanized. And that is always an option, and that is usually an option used for imperial purposes. It has a rightfully deserved horrific connotation, but pretty much every empire ever forged has had to use that, particular thing, and that is one way to do it. Egypt has the same thing with killing and expelling different people. Assyria did it, Persia did it, China's done it, Turkey's done it. Everyone's done it. India's done it. Native tribes have done it. Like there are stories of native tribes forcing other native tribes out of the area, or killing them all, or killing all the men and taking them in as wives and things, and taking the women as wives and slaves. It's happened everywhere. That is how, if you want a stable empire, if that is your goal, it is true. You can't. It's hard to have an empire based on multiculturalism. If you want an empire, you can have democracy and things like that based on multiculturalism. If you base, I suppose same with empire, but if you base it on the idea of multiculturalism, like Persia did for a while before it got conquered by the Greeks, it based itself on multiculturalism and the idea that it can function like that. But if you base yourself on the idea that your cities and your people are the best, and then you're conquering outward, the only option is to kill the outsider and to replace them, or not kill all of them, but kill most of them, and then enslave the rest. That is the best option if you're doing that, as terrible as it is.
Towns of Ashur and Nineveh to include the whole of...
So, as ridiculous as it is, Germany was just very late to the party when it came to doing that, and we had... Well, it was still horrific back in the past, and people hated that, but they were late to the party when it came to ethnic genocide.
Mesopotamia, the eastern...
They were wrong to do it, and Rome was wrong to do it, and everyone was wrong to do it. Don't get me wrong, it's horrific, but it is what it is, man. That's how empires are built.
Coast of the Mediterranean, and even, by 680 BCE, Egypt. They did this thanks to the most brutal, terrifying, and efficient army the world had ever seen. 4 adjectives describing my college girlfriend. For one thing, the army was a meritocracy. Generals weren't chosen based on who their dads were. They were chosen based on if they were good at generaling. Stan, is generaling a word? It is! Also, they were super mean. Like, they would deport hundreds of thousands of people to separate them from their history and their families, and also moved skilled workers around where they were most needed.
Yep. That's also something the Mongols did. The Mongols did that too. Again, that, as bad as it is, that is how successful empires are built. You have to do that. Unless you are basing yourself entirely on multiculturalism, which honestly tends to make you weaker than those who don't, because you have to be more inclusive. And during this time period, having a strong military is incredibly important. That's why you saw the Greeks so easily, well, not so well, Alexander the Great was genius, but you saw more intolerant people have a tendency to beat out tolerant people because they care more, if that makes sense. If you really hate somebody else, or you really want your people to expand, you're probably more zealoty than people who are more multicultural and more urbanized. That's why you see more. That's why the Mongols managed to conquer China, because China was super urbanized, and then the Mongols became super urbanized, and then ended up becoming Chinese themselves and getting that forced out. Anyway, you see it throughout history.
Also, the Neo-Assyrians loved...
Not trying to make excuses for anything anybody's done, but that's just how it goes.
...to find would-be rebels and lop off their appendages, particularly their noses for some reason. And there was your standard raping and pillaging and torture, all of which was done in the name of Ashur, the great god of the Neo-Assyrians, whose divine regent was the king. Ashur, through the king, kept the world going, and as long as conquest continued, the world would not end. But if conquest ever stopped, the world would end, and there would be rivers of blood and weeping and gnashing of teeth. You know how apocalypses go. The Assyrians spread this worldview with propaganda like monumental architecture and readings about how awesome the king was at public festivals, all of which was designed to inspire awe in the empire's subjects. Oh, that reminds me, it's time for the open letter. An open letter to the word awesome. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, Stan, is this yellow cake uranium? You never find that in Mesopotamia. Dear Awesome, I love you. Like most contemporary English speakers, in fact, I probably love you a little too much. The thing about you, Awesome, is that awesome is just so awesomely awesome at being awesome. So we lose track of what you really mean, awesome. You're not just cool, you're terrifying and wonderful. Your knees buckling, chest tightening, fearful encounters with something radically other, something that we know could both crush and bless us. That is awe. And I apologize for having watered you down, but seriously, you're awesome. Best wishes, John Green. So what happened to the Assyrians? Well, first they extended their empire beyond their roads, making administration impossible. But more importantly, when your whole worldview is based on the idea that the apocalypse will come if you ever lose a battle, and then you lose one battle, the whole worldview just blows up. That eventually happened, and in 612 BCE, the city of Nineveh was finally conquered and the Neo-Assyrian Empire had come to its end. But the idea of empire was just
quite brutally, too. They butchered the Assyrians. An eye for an eye, I suppose.
getting started. Next week, we'll talk about mummies. Oh, I have to talk about other things, too. Crap, I only want to talk about mummies. Anyway, we'll be talking about
Sudan,
No! Dang it! We'll actually be talking about
Egypt.
Thank you, Smart Globe. See you next week. Today's episode of Crash Course was produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Danica Johnson. The show was written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, with some help from myself. And our graphics team is Thought Bubble. Last week's phrase of the week was better boyfriend. If you want to take a guess at this week's phrase of the week, you can do so in comments, where you can also suggest new phrases of the week. And if you have any questions about today's show, leave them in comments, and our team of semi-professional quasi-historians will endeavor to answer them.
College girlfriend, I have a feeling, is the saying of this week. But great content as always. Crash Course is amazing. If you haven't subscribed to Crash Course, you really should. Go like, subscribe, and everything else like that. I think they have Patreon and everything else like that too. And not when this first came out, but they do now. Amazing content. If you liked my reaction ramble about this, I guess give me a like, give me a comment, and everything else like that. Give me a sub and everything else like that. Go join my Twitch, go join my Discord, other things like that. Yeah. Love, butts, and happiness, and everything else like that. And I'll see you in the next one, probably tomorrow. Hopefully I can stream tomorrow. Who knows?